Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew, author of the Infinity series and founder of Engine Books. Let's see what we have today. Thank you for joining me for another wonderful episode of the Write Project podcast. I know I say that they are all wonderful, but this one really is. All the other episodes are trash. This one is perfect. We are on the line with JM DeMatteis, one of the most storied authors at Marvel Comics and DC Comics. He has written for one of the greatest runs of the Justice League ever, the Justice League International League, or the Justice League Friends League, whatever you want to call it. And also is a long-storied author for Spider-Man and many other titles. Wrote possibly the greatest Spider-Man graphic novel of all time, Kraven's Last Hunt. Crazy to have him on with us. Thank you for joining us, JM DeMatteis.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so we have an interesting crop of readers on this. So the Write Project readers or viewers, from my understanding, are pretty divided into, because I'm divided in this, so I attract both sorts, from complete nerds who love comic books and grew up reading comic books like me, and literary fiction people. And what's really funny is when I get on because I write fiction, so when I get on lit fiction people, the comic book fans don't know who the heck these people are. And when I get on the comic book people, the lit fiction people don't know who the heck this is. So for the benefit of the lit fiction people, why JM DeMatteis is such a big name, I did the math, and I think he's sold over 1 billion units so far with his name on it. Yeah, you look surprised. I don't think you knew that.
Yeah. I don't think I knew that either.
Yeah. So that's quite a number. We like that number around here. Thank you for joining.
Where's the check for that one? Wow.
Yeah. Between reprints and single issues, and you were on the biggest titles during like the biggest eras for kind of like the 90s during the boom and stuff like that. So that contributes a lot. You know
that's interesting. It's an interesting way to look at it. That's very funny. I never thought about the cumulative sales of like a lifetime of a career, you know?
Yeah. Everything. Thank you for joining us. So I had some questions. First of all, about Ben Reilly Spider-Man. I went out and got a copy, read it. It's excellent. Love it. Tell us about this book. What drew you to it? You know, there seems to, it's one of the most controversial eras of Spider-Man history, but like, I feel like it's getting its due again. Like I've been rereading the old Clone Saga and it's fine.
Yeah. The Clone Saga, the infamous Clone Saga, as we call it,
Yep.
had its ups and downs for sure, but it had a lot of great elements in it. You know, it went off the rails in certain points and came back on. But, and one of the best things that came out of it was this character of Ben Reilly, who was Peter Parker's clone, one of Peter Parker's clone, because there was Ben Reilly, there was Kane, another phenomenal character. Yep. We had some great new villains that popped up during that period of time. So there was some really good stuff. That's when I did a Ben Reilly series called Spider-Man: The Lost Years, which filled in the years before he returned to the book. It was one of my favorite things I ever did with the great John Romita Jr.
Yeah.
That's during the Clone Saga when I did the Death of Aunt May. Spoiler, she got better. But it's one of my all-time favorite stories that I've ever done. And so, yeah, you're right. In recent years, we've seen all of these characters come back. At the time, it was just at the end of the boom. And just like with the tech bubble, the bubble burst, and comic sales started to go down. The truth of the matter is, though, the Spider-Man sales held on a lot more than most of the other titles.
Yeah.
And yet somehow it got identified in people's head that somehow the Clone Saga killed Spider-Man sales. No, sales went down everywhere.
Yeah.
And actually Spider-Man did better than most. So, and if there was an issue with the Clone Saga in the beginning, I think it was that it was a little too successful because the marketing people kept saying, we had a plan in the beginning. We're going to do this for like 6 months or a year. After which Peter and Mary Jane, Peter will find out that he's been the clone all along. It was why I liked it I like stories that play with identity. I love Philip K. Dick. I love classic Twilight Zone stories, where like person thinks they're one thing, it turns out they're another. Who are we really? what makes us us? Yeah, what and how we perceive ourselves versus who we really are in other people's eyes. All those questions always fascinate me. So when the story was presented to me that the Peter that we knew was the clone, and this guy who thought he was a clone all these years comes back and discovers he's the real one, it's like a great Philip K. Dick novel or a Twilight Zone episode or something. So I really responded to that, and we were gonna have this play out over the course of maybe 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
At the end of a year, Peter and Mary Jane were going to go off and live happily ever after and have their baby, because Mary Jane got pregnant in the course of the story. And then Ben was going to take over as Spider-Man. We were going to reboot all the books with number 1, build up a new supporting cast, new villains, and really do a fresh start so that you'd have the best of both worlds. You could always bring Peter back anytime you wanted him, but you had a whole new beginning for Spider-Man.
Yeah.
But the marketing people kept saying, well, let's do another big event. Let's stretch it out a little bit more. And it kept getting stretched out because it was successful. And there was a certain point where, and plus there were a lot of other changes going on at Marvel at the time. It was, I don't know whether it was during the bankruptcy or right before the bankruptcy, but a lot of things were changing.
Yeah.
And it reached a point on the Spider-Man books where I thought, I wasn't having as much fun as I wanted to. So I kind of parachuted out at a certain point. Also, it was really, it was a great group of writers. And we would get together every 2 weeks at Marvel or at a hotel somewhere and have a writers meeting. And we would have, everybody really respected each other and enjoyed each other. And we had a great time. But it wasn't that much fun going home writing chapter 2 of a 4-part story because all the books were interlocked.
Yeah. I
wish they figured out
when they rebooted or not rebooted, but when they did Brand New Day, they just cancel all the titles and then had like 4 Amazing Spider-Man a month written by one dude, then another arc next month written by another.
Right.
I wish they'd figured that out then. Yeah.
Yeah. And also when you have conflicting, contrasting voices, because my writing voice isn't Tom DeFalco's writing voice, wasn't Howard Mackey's writing voice, wasn't Terry Kavanaugh's or Todd DeZago's, and those things can clash as well. And I would find myself in positions where I tend to be very spontaneous when I write. So I'd be working on my chapter 2 and have this brainstorm at the end and flip something in the plot. And then say, poor Tom DeFalco, who's writing part 3, what happened one time, he'd already written his plot for part 3, but I changed the ending of part 2 and he had to go back and change the thing. And I felt terribly guilty. But anyway, so at a certain point I left, but I always had great affection for these characters, for Ben and Kane especially. And I've done a few little short Ben and Kane stories over the years, but when I got this call last year from Marvel, and basically all they had to say was Ben Reilly, and I was like, yes, I will do this, because he's such a fascinating character. And then they said, well, we're going to set this in that Clone Saga era, just at the moment when Peter and Mary Jane have left, and Ben, after basically 5 years as an exile, and coming back and being confused about his identity, has just discovered that he's not a clone, he's the real guy, and he gets to be Spider-Man again for the first time.
Yep.
And talk about questions of identity. Who am I? He can't be Peter Parker anymore, because Peter Parker lives in Portland with his wife and his soon-to-be baby. So he's still this fake identity of Ben Reilly, which means he can't go back and be with any family or friends from before. That door is closed to him. So who am I? I'm back home, but it's not the same home. And I'm not the same person. So a lot of the story is about Ben rebuilding his own personal identity and his life. It's actually easier for him being Spider-Man than it is being Ben, because he knows how to be Spider-Man. Put on a costume and jump around and punch somebody in the face and you're off, But
in some ways, it's like a role that it's like an actor's that to this week, the role of Spider-Man will be played by Ben Reilly. Like they're both playing the same character when they put on the mask. And
right. In a way, that's true. And because it's got the mask, Spider-Man is consistent. Whereas Peter, it's this back and forth. Who am I? So that's been one of the things that's been really, really a lot of fun for this series, because I like to do deep dives into the characters' heads, and Ben has a very interesting head to dive into.
That's awesome. That's amazing. I'm really looking forward to this series. So is it a mini series that's 5 issues, or is it this is an ongoing and this is just the first 5-issue arc?
No, it's a 5-issue mini series, and we'll see what happens after that. I know there's talk of us doing something else afterwards, but I can't say what yet.
That's fair. That's fair. That's fair. I have the nerdiest question of all nerdiest questions because I am a massive comic fan, Marvel fan, and Spider-Man. And if you don't want to
Okay.
answer it, that's fine. And I'll cut it that I asked you it because it's just the
Okay.
most nerdy, deep cut continuity BS question.
Wow. Now I'm fascinated. I want to know what it is.
In the issue, they reference Peter and Mary Jane just moved to Portland. Makes sense. And that they have the baby on the way. Makes sense. So when you're writing this, are you writing it in the continuity of the time as though they're married, or are you being like, no, they're just dating and they're having a baby? Like,
no,
okay,
it's the continuity that in my mind, they're
yep,
married. You know,
perfect.
I'm a big proponent of the spider marriage. I really loved writing Peter and Mary Jane when they were married.
Yeah,
You know, it's such an important part of Kraven's Last Hunt as well, you know, having that fact that they had just gotten married being the thing that is driving Peter to come back from the grave.
yeah, no, that's awesome. That's I'm also a big proponent of the marriage. Not that my opinion matters or anything like that, but I always find this new readers push and changing things crazily weird because for me, I got into comics because of the Spider-Man cartoon show, and like that was on during the time, the 90s one.
Right.
And I remember knowing that it was a comic, but the marketing for stuff is weird because you just kind of assume that kids know that there's a Spider-Man comic, and I didn't. I was like 10, so I knew there was a TV show, but I actually didn't know there was a comic book. There was no ad at the end that said pick up
Right.
Spider-Man every month.
Right.
So when I learned,
which is amazing that they never do that. It's astonishing that they never do that.
But so at the end of I discovered it in back issues, and I thought Spider-Man was a long dead property that they'd stopped making the comic. So I was like, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get every air quotes important issue of Spider-Man ever. There was no internet back then. So I used to go around and try to find like, okay, well, I saw the episode where they introduced the Scorpion. I'm going to try to find that back issue, that reprint where he finds the Scorpion. I tried to basically collect the animated series in comic book form by getting those back issues because I was a child and I didn't know better, so I tried to do that. And I would have to guess by the covers because they were always taped. So I would have to like, I think this is that issue. Go home, discover it's not. See a reference to like, oh, the star, the editor says, check out this issue. Then I'd have to find that issue to get the whole story, and eventually had this massive collection. But I was years of collecting comics before I happened to walk into a drug mart and see a new issue of Spider-Man. And it was one written by you, and I just happened to walk by. Yeah,
that's funny.
Yeah, and it was during the Clone Saga epic. But I was like, they still make the, but it was supposed to be there.
So even while you were getting these back issues, you had no idea they were still making current day Spider-Man comics.
Exactly.
Wow.
I thought it was a dead franchise that they were then making like reprints, and that the animated series would eventually run out of material.
Wow, that's amazing.
And this is what pulls at my hair when they do all these marketing initiatives, because like all you need to do is have a good series, and then at the end of the saying, by the way, if you want to see Spidey's new adventures, go pick up the monthly comic.
Right, 30 seconds. Yeah. 30 seconds.
Yeah. Anyway, that's wonderful. I had some nitty-gritty writing questions for you, silly stuff. So we talk about the different writing processes, the people that just sit and write, the people that plan, all that kind of stuff. I wanted the opportunity to talk to you because you were there you've been writing in comics for a very long time. Since it was basically like, I mean, when you did Kraven's Last Hunt, the like multi-arc story that was basically seemed like it was written for a trade was a new thing. Like that was new.
Collections were fairly new. I mean, when they collected Kraven and put it in a hardcover, that was a huge deal. That happened very, very rarely. You know, it was a, you know, graphic novels were a new thing. Collected editions were a new thing. It was a really, the 80s were a very creative and exciting time, and it was new stuff happening constantly.
So I want to ask about, like, just from a writing process perspective, if you can, like, get yourself in the headspace there of what's different between writing comics in the old days, like plotting, planning, whatever you do, and doing it now in the like multi-part arc era where it's expected to be 5 or 6 parts. Like, how does the breakdown happen?
Right.
That kind of stuff.
Right. Well, you know, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that is a shift. And especially, you know, when I work on an ongoing, though, I still like to break things up. I still believe in the power of the single issue story. A single issue story can have a lot of impact. Not everything has to be an epic. Something can be one issue and be more epic than the 7-part story that you did. But when you're working certainly I never thought about I'm writing for the trade. That never crossed my mind, and or someone said this must be 6 issues. It never really came up. It just, you follow the story naturally. If it's 4 parts, it's 4 parts. If it's 6 parts, it's 6 parts. If it's 1 part, it's 1 part. So I never really thought that way. But in terms of differences between then and now, I don't know. That's a really good question, because to me, story is story.
Yeah.
I'm always just looking for a good story. I'm always looking to peel back the top of the characters' heads and see what's going on in there. I like to write from the inside out. So that approach to story hasn't really changed. Some of the outer husk of things changed. There was a while there in the 90s when the whole image thing became big, and there were all these poster shots in books. And then decompression came in, and suddenly a 22-page story had about 7 pages of story in it.
Yeah.
Not everybody. The people that did it wrong did it that way. The people that knew what they were doing knew that decompression allowed them to dive deeper and explore the story better. But a lot of people didn't know that. And so I remember reading some stuff, and I'm reading some story, and it's like, I'm on page 8. Why is it over? Because they just took 8 pages worth of story and blew it up to 22 pages with lots of double page spreads and all this stuff,
Yeah.
So sometimes, more big spreads are popular, or, at a certain point, it was like, no, we don't use thought balloons anymore. Everything has to be in captions. Well, the thought balloon is a wonderful tool for certain times, I guess in my mind, comics are never just one thing. They're anything we want them to be. I work in a lot of different styles. I work in a lot of different genres, and I'm just following the story, and the story usually dictates to me the best way to tell it. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah. In my mind, like, I never had the pleasure of ever speaking to like Stan Lee when I was alive. When he was alive, or anything like that. To me, like, talking to you right now, you're the most like him I've ever seen from interviews, and your writing's the most like his. Where I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult or nothing, but like, there's this, like, reading your stuff, and I've read a lot of it over the last month since we've been talking and going back and kind of refreshing, with the exception of like a few like Kraven's Last Hunt, a few like dark moments and stuff like that. Most of it, it's got this like your uncle puts you on the shoulder, pats you on the shoulder, and says, like, come here, I want to tell you a story, and it might be a little bit scary at times, but it's okay, I'm here for you. It's very comforting, but not infantile,
Yeah, well, I hope not infantile.
No,
well,
just...
and any comparison to Stan is fine with me. Because all of us that came into comics in the years after that, we were all influenced by Stan and by Jack Kirby.
Yep.
Jack Kirby, one of the great geniuses of all time, not just in comics, but in any art, as far as I'm concerned. So that stuff is, even if our styles are diametrically opposed to that, and that imprint is there, because those are certain things it's almost like a cattle brand in our imaginations, and it's there. It will never go away. It's the same thing with sort of certain primal stories we encounter as a kid, whether it's Peter Pan or The Wizard of Oz, Pinocchio, certain stories, whether I read them or saw them in movies when I was a kid, that imagery, those stories stay with me. I grew up when I was very little, watching The Twilight Zone, and those stories, that worldview, that attitude, all these, everything we read, it all kind of goes into our unconscious, and then it comes out through the filter of our own personalities.
Yep.
All these influences. But then, we have our own individual experiences. We have our own obsessions, our own themes. And my themes aren't Stan Lee's themes, or anybody else's. They're my obsessions. But those things that we encountered when we're young, and it's the same thing with music, the music that imprints in us when we're young is the music we carry in our hearts in a very unique way forever. So, any comparison to Stan, I'll never be offended by. Not at all.
Well, comparing one writer to another sometimes is fraught. You know what I mean?
No, it's like saying, oh, it reminds me a little of Charles Dickens, but in the comic book frame,
For sure.
I'm really insulted. You're comparing me to Charles Dickens? Are you kidding? No, of course you love that.
I have one foot in the lit fiction world. I have people who, if I compared them to Charles Dickens, would scoff and say, that hack, he wrote extra words for more money. The sentence should guide you.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
I'm not one of those, and
Me neither.
I happen to bow before the altar of Charles Dickens, so that's okay.
Same. Yeah. Oh my, people's egos. That's wonderful. So you're writing Spider-Man and Justice League currently. Anything else on the horizon that we're allowed to know about?
That's the question that you're allowed to know about. I have about, at the moment, 5 different original creator-owned comics in process that I'm working with 5 different artists on. I just recently completed a novella that will be out, hopefully, probably, I would hope by the spring.
Like prose?
Yeah, prose.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'll check that out.
Well, I've written prose before.
I did not know that.
It's been about 10 years. About 10 years ago, I had a young adult fantasy called Imaginalis that came out from HarperCollins. Yeah.
Nice.
And this is the first time in about a decade that I've done prose, and I've loved it. And I'm probably going to do another novella after this. And like I said, all these new original things, I work in the animation field, so that stuff is always percolating as well. So I'm probably this year, it's a great thing after doing this for so long, but I was looking at my schedule the other day and I said, I'm as busy this year or busier than I've ever been. Right now I know I'm booked straight through practically the whole summer, so, you just keep, it's what we do. You just keep creating new stuff.
Yeah.
That's what you do. You have
that
to.
Is.
I mean, some years back, I went through a period where I was like wondering whether I should go on with this and still be a writer. And it was a really, really difficult thing to even think about that because, we identify with what we do.
Yeah.
And especially when you're creative, because it's coming out of such intimate parts of you, you can't separate your creative self from the rest of yourself. And I had to really surrender my writer self to the universe to figure out whether I should be going forward with this or not. And what I got back was, hey, dummy, you're a writer. You'd be doing this. If no one was paying me, I'd be laying on the floor, staring into space, making up stories. It's just who I am. Yeah. And that will never change. And when I'm 100, it'll never change. I'll still be doing it. It's just the way it is.
That's the way I keep hearing. It's like that old soldiers thing. Like old soldiers don't die; they just fade away. Old writers don't die; they just stop writing or whatever. Old writers don't stop writing; they just end at the keyboard or whatever. I don't know.
Well, Orson Welles died over his typewriter.
You know what? I cannot think of a better way to go. I know that's sad and morbid, but yeah, that sounds.
But I know, if you go, it's like when you hear about performers that have died on stage. On one level, it's like, oh my God. Another level, they were literally doing this thing that they loved more than anything when they went out.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. JM DeMatteis, if you were on a desert island, what 3 books would you want with you to keep you company?
Wow, that's a hell of a question.
Yeah.
I have a really massive collection of Ray Bradbury short stories. I think it's his 50 greatest stories in this big hardcover. So I definitely would take that. I would take maybe David Copperfield.
Yep.
So we can't have 3 fiction and 3 nonfiction. That's just be 3 books and that's it, huh?
3 books.
Okay. The 3rd book, we'd have to go more philosophically, and I'm not sure which book it would be exactly, but it would be a book either written by or about a spiritual master named Meher Baba, who was very important to my life. So I'd have all this great fiction to read and my little spiritual juice to drink as well.
I am not familiar with that, and now I'm going to have to be, because I'm the type person, when I hear something new, I've got to go read it and read about it. How do you spell that?
Meher.
Yep.
It's the first, and then Baba, Meher Baba.
Excellent. When I go back and edit this, I will write that down.
Okay.
JM DeMatteis, what is a book that you want to read but find intimidating? Are there any intimidating books on your to be read list that you're like, oh, that's too long, or that's too rough, or it's there?
No, not too intimidating. Once I realized that I got through Moby Dick, I think I could get through just about anything. And I loved Moby Dick, but it was definitely intimidating. It's interesting. A story that I love, and I've been into the book 2 times, and I will finish it one day, and I've never been able to finish it, is Les Miserables. And I think it's one of the greatest stories ever written. Show me a movie version. I saw the Broadway play, 3 times. It's one of the greatest stories ever. And yet, I think it's, there was a style of writing, and certainly in the 1800s and before, where there's a lot of digressions.
Yeah.
And it's just they did it in Moby Dick as well. It's like, now I'm going to tell you about ambergris or whatever, for like 50 pages. And what happened to this story, But somehow in Moby Dick, it all worked for me. I love that he kept shifting styles and going on. And there's a lot of that in Les Miserables. But it's such a phenomenal story. I have I think it was in 1939. It was the first big thing, speaking of Orson Welles, that Orson Welles ever did on radio, which was an adaptation of Les Miserables. And it's brilliant. It's just brilliant. And you could probably get it for free online. I know if you go to archive.org,
Nice.
If you have any affection for that story, seek that out. So, I've been like hundreds and hundreds of pages through Les Miserables and then stopped, But this is my great challenge in life, is to finish Les Miserables.
That's me with, and don't kill me, that's me with Tolkien. I love the adaptations. I love the story, but something about the writing style, I know it's good, like intellectually, I'm like, this is wonderful, but when I sit down and try to read it, I'm like, oh my god.
But and then certain books, they do that to us. They might do it to us 3-4 times, and one day you pick it up and something has changed. One of my favorite books in the world is Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. Yep. And I remember I tried to read that, and I read it when I was like a teenager. I remember picking it up and trying to read it several times. I was like, oh, nah, not interested, but I kept it on the shelf. And then one night I pulled it off the shelf, and this magical chemical dropped in my brain, and I fell in love with that book. And I've read it, multiple times over the years. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And I would sneak that into the desert island in my back pocket.
And sometimes there's a book that's not made for you, and it's okay. Like,
yes, absolutely.
I'm in a reading group right now with my goddaughter, and she's lovely, and she reads avidly, and she's 16. She reads a book a day, and she reads almost exclusively books in the LGBTQ spectrum, LGBTQ writers, characters, stuff like that. And I hadn't read a lot of that, and so we started a book club where, like, I would give her a book of mine, and she would give me a book of hers, and then we talk about what we thought of it. And a lot of it's not for me, but I love it, and I go through it. I'm like, okay, and getting new perspectives, and that's fun, and getting to know her better through her.
Right, and sometimes it's okay to just walk away from a book. When I was younger, if I started a book, even if I hated it, I had to finish it. And as I got older, I thought, you know what? I've just given this book 150 pages or 200 pages. It ain't working. I'm not reading it. Forget it. It's the same thing with movies too. It's like, I don't have to sit here for 2 hours or 2.5 hours. If I've watched an hour and it's not doing it for me. Yep. So it's okay to walk away too. But I always want to give it enough time and space, because things sometimes take time to build.
Yep, for sure. JM DeMatteis, what's the most unfortunate character name you've ever encountered?
Unfortunate character name. Wow. Let me think if one even comes to mind. In comics, there's a lot of stupid character names. I'm certainly, one of mine that comes to mind, although it was meant tongue in cheek, was this villain who was like really into how should we put it, making America great again. He thought, the 1800s, that was the time when everything was great, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he dressed like that, and he was basically warring against the modern world. So the name I gave him was, bear with me, first name Turner, middle initial D, last name Century. Turner D. Century.
That's brilliant. That's pretty good.
It's both brilliant and stupid at the same time. So I think I'll put that out as my dumb character name.
That is the dad joke of character names, and that's fine. Sometimes you need a good dad joke. Yeah. JM DeMatteis, what's your favorite place to read? To actually like curl up with a book?
My favorite place to read, probably either on the couch, stretched out on the couch, or in bed. Oh, and I also love to read in the bathtub. I've encountered other people that do that. I can like get in the bathtub and sit there with a book for like an hour and just read. And I find it to be one of the most relaxing things that one could ever do.
That sounds fun. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I will let you go at that. Okay. Thank you so much. You've been very
this was a pleasure. This was a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you, JM DeMatteis, for coming on the Right Project podcast. Hope it wasn't too painful, and we're looking forward to the rest of everything you do.
Pleasure to be here, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.